Hi, and welcome to our course for vascular ultrasound for working sonographers. We're going to start today with looking at a little bit of our sonographic principles as well as vascular anatomy. Obviously, this is a very short course for becoming fully competent with your vascular scanning, but hopefully it will get you on the route to feeling a little bit more comfortable with your scanning and a little bit more confident in working with your Doppler principles. So we're going to start today with some of those Doppler principles, which might be a little bit of a review for many of you, but it's a great place to start because sometimes when we forget some of these details, it can cause us some confusion when we get to understanding how our velocities and our Dopplers are working within the vascular system. So with that, let's get started. Our objectives of today are to list the properties of sound through soft tissue and explain the Doppler principles, list the common Doppler artifacts and define the major vessels of the vascular system, and differentiate between arterial and venous anatomy. So part one of this lecture, we're going to go ahead and look at those sonographic principles. Again, if this is a little bit repetitive or something you're already comfortable with, you may want to skip through some of this, but for many of us, this is always a good reminder. So the basics of sonography is we know that sonograms, ultrasounds, our images with sonography are produced by sound waves. Our sound waves are emitted by a piezoelectric element within our transducer. That piezoelectric element, when it gets stimulated by a voltage stimulation, it will cause that element to expand and contract, creating a mechanical motion, which in turn creates this mechanical sound wave. As the sound wave propagates or moves through tissue, it's going to be encountering different mediums. So any different type of cell, any different type of tissue will have a different interaction with the sound. And it's those differences between tissue types that our sound is coming in contact with that actually causes reflections or echoes to return to our transducer. So anytime we have a significant change in impedance, which defines a material's density and stiffness and their propagation speed, or the speed at which the sound goes through the tissue, anytime there's a change in impedance between one tissue material and another, we'll get some sort of reflection. If there's no change in impedance, meaning there's no change in speed, there's no change in density of the tissue, and there's no change in stiffness of the tissue, if there's no changes there, any of these three things, there'll be no change in impedance, and therefore the sound will just continue on through. Now, we rely on reflections or changes in impedance to create echoes back to create ultimately our image. So once my sound wave hits a material where it experiences a change in impedance, some of that sound may continue through, other portion of that sound wave may be reflected. And when this reflected sound wave comes back, it interacts with that piezoelectric element, which again expands and contracts, and that expansion and contraction or mechanical motion is going to create a correlating voltage that will feed our system and produce ultimately our brightness or our echoes on our screen. Now, the system is very, very intelligent in that it knows exactly the moment in which the sound waves was released from the transducer. We also know exactly how fast, well, almost exactly how fast sound goes through soft tissue. So just like if you're on the freeway and you know you're going 60 miles and you know that you're traveling 60 miles per hour, if those two things were true, you would get from point A to B in exactly 1 hour. Same kind of idea here. If we know that the sound is transmitting through the soft tissue at a particular speed, which we'll talk about in a moment, and we know exactly how long the sound wave has been gone before it returned, we can deduct exactly how deep that sound went to meet with its reflector before it returned. Now, in order to understand this, we have to understand that the speed of sound, or what we call the propagation speed in tissue, is equal to 1.54 millimeters per microsecond. So if my sound is traveling at 1.54 millimeters per microsecond and it travels 3 centimeters, we know that we can calculate how long it should be gone for before it returns. Now, without dragging you through all the math on how they determine this, the factor that they've come up with is that sound travels at 13 microseconds per centimeter, round trip. So for every centimeter the sound transverses, if it goes 1 centimeter and back, that would take 13 microseconds. If it went 2 centimeters and back, that would be 13 microseconds per centimeter, so we'd have now 26 microseconds. If it went 3 centimeters and back, now we'd have 3 centimeters, we'd have 13, 13, and 13 microseconds, or 39 microseconds. So by however long the sound was gone for, the transducer can deduce how deep it went and where the reflection is coming from, and that's how it knows where to place the echo on our display screen. Now, a few other things that we won't go into as in depth as you would in, say, your physics, your physics instrumentation course, but deserves a quick review, are going to be the characteristics of pulse ultrasound. So in the instance we just described before, we have a transducer. That transducer has piezoelectric elements. Piezoelectric elements expand and contract when they're stimulated with a voltage. Now, Principle 1 of ultrasound says that this is the typical principle that most ultrasound machines operate off of. And the idea behind this principle is that it will release a pulse of probably about 2 to 3 cycles of sound. And it will wait for that pulse to go as deep as it wants it to go and return, and then collect that information before it emits another pulse. And so when we're studying ultrasound, we really look at the pulses as a packet or an individual unit. When we're looking at a pulse like this as an individual unit, there can be some parameters that we use to define it by. So here's a pulse, and this pulse would have 2 cycles. So when we're looking at a pulse of sound, we know that we have a complete wave of variation above and below the line, and when it comes back to its neutral, that would be 1 cycle. So this example here would have 2 cycles in 1 pulse. Now, if I wanted to see how much space or how much distance in space this particular pulse was taking up, I would evaluate it for its spatial pulse length. Now, I have 2 waves, and each wave has its own wavelength, or distance from the front of the wave to the back of the wave. I would multiply 2 times the wavelength, as you see here. Wavelength times the number of cycles in the pulse. And when I determined that, that would tell me my spatial pulse length. Now, you might wonder what this has to do with anything, but one of the most important functions of spatial pulse length is that it determines our axial resolution, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, of our image. So axial resolution is determined by spatial pulse length. What axial resolution is, it's our ability of our system to define 2 objects placed front to back in a scanning volume. So if we have a small spatial pulse length, then we are able to squeeze in between these 2 items more efficiently, provide echoes coming back from that area, and demonstrate them better. If we have a larger spatial pulse length, our pulse is so big it can't fit in between there to get an echo out of, to produce an echo out of that area, and we will make these 2 items look like one. Now that's a description of axial resolution. Our spatial pulse length is the definition of axial resolution. By controlling the wavelength, or the distance a wave takes up, and controlling the number of waves in a pulse, we can either shorten or lengthen that spatial pulse length, which would then go on to affect our axial resolution. Now, another very important component that has less to do with maybe our resolution of our image, but more to do with the speed in which our images are produced, is called our pulse repetition period. Now, each pulse technically should be able to produce one image. So if I gathered all the pulses that were emitted at the same time, or same general time across my transducer here, and I organized them, I could produce an image. Now, if you remember, our transducer sends out one pulse and it waits for all of the echoes from that pulse to be collected before it will send another pulse. And that wait time between the time it sent its first pulse and the time it sent its second pulse is also going to affect the wait time between the first image, that flicker you will see. So if you remember ever watching an old movie or going to the theater when before the picture show started, you would see a lot of flickering as the tape reeled. Well, that's because there was a delay in between seeing one frame to the next. Now, we never see that anymore because technology is so much better. We see these nice smooth images, which would mean there's a very small delay. Well, how does that relate to ultrasound? If I send out a pulse, wait a while, send out another pulse, I'll have an image with a big gap of time and then another image. But if I repeat pulses very quickly with something like a high pulse repetition period, that would cause more images to be produced at closer intervals of time, and it would decrease that flickering effect. Now, our ability to visualize a smooth image without that flickering effect is referred to as our temporal resolution. So the higher our pulse repetition period is the time it takes for our pulse to occur and our listening time before the next pulse occurs. And when I have a long listening time, that makes my pulse repetition period longer. So as I have an increased pulse repetition period, I am going to decrease the number of frames or images I produce, which would then decrease my temporal or my real-time resolution. Now, pulse duration is another important component to look at here. Pulse duration is very similar to our pulse repetition period, except rather than looking at the whole time it takes of production and listening time, like pulse repetition period takes, it only looks at the pulse production time. So pulse duration is the measurement of only how long it took to produce a pulse. Duty factor is the percentage of time that the machine is actually producing pulses. So if we just glanced at this very elementary image I have drawn here, here's my on time, here's my off time, you might look at this and say, oh, I'm getting cycles produced about half the time. Our duty factor would be about 50%. Now, the real duty factor for most recent ultrasound machines is 0.1% to 0.01%. Now, this is important to know. That means that while you have your transducer on your patient and you have your image unfrozen, that patient will only be receiving sound waves in their body 1% or to 0.01% of the time. Now, so spatial pulse length is important to us still because it is going to define how well we can see anatomy in our axial resolution or from front to back of our image. If I decrease my spatial pulse length, I have improved my axial resolution. Now, we know that increasing frequency, meaning squeezing more little sound waves in a pulse, is going to increase my resolution. That's what we're taught from day one of ultrasound school. If you want better resolution, you go higher frequency. The reason that does that is because when I shorten up these wavelengths of my sound waves, they are compressed closer together and they decrease our spatial pulse length. So increasing frequency decreases spatial pulse length, which improves my axial resolution. Pulse repetition period, on the other hand, means the longer my wait time is, the deeper in my system, my tissue I'm looking, the longer I have to have my listening or wait time on, the longer it is until I can produce the next pulse. The longer it takes me to produce the next pulse means I have a larger gap between one image and another. And that larger gap between one image and another means that as I increase my pulse repetition period, making it longer, I would decrease my number of images in a particular amount of time, which would mean I would decrease my temporal resolution, or my resolution in real time. Okay, pulse duration just looks at how much, like I said, how much space a pulse takes up, whereas duty factor determines what percentage of time is my system actually insunating my patient. And as you can imagine, the lower your duty factor, the lower the probability of biologic effects for your patients. Now, I do bring up continuous wave briefly here because everything I've talked about is pulse wave. We're sending out a pulse, we're waiting, our transducer's working with it. We also have the option, mostly in vascular ultrasound, of utilizing continuous wave sounds. Now, continuous wave, we know, has a transducer, and it's usually one or two piezoelectric elements, one that's emitting and one that's receiving. And it is constantly emitting that sound wave, which means a continuous wave ultrasound has a duty factor of 100%. Now, because it's constantly emitting sound, it cannot demonstrate depth because it doesn't know how long a responsive echo has been gone for, because it's constantly emitting and receiving sound. So we do not produce images with our continuous wave ultrasound. But what we can produce is a spectral Doppler, something that looks like this. And one of the reasons, and this can be used primarily in echo or other small vascular exams, it can primarily show you higher velocity changes than you would get from a pulsed system. And so that's why we still implement this. And oftentimes these little transducers just look something like a little pin on a cord. Okay, we already talked about a number of these items here that I have on this slide, but we'll just go just do a quick little review of it. So I talked a little bit about attenuation. So as my transducer emits sound, it's going to be encountering soft tissues with many, many different properties. And as it encounters those soft tissues of different properties, if those tissues have a change in impedance, like I mentioned, then we know that it's going to have some reflection. And when we have some sound wave reflected and other sound wave is transmitted, the amplitude of the transmitted wave is going to decrease because of attenuation. One full sound wave coming down interacts, part of it is sent back, the other part continues. We're going to have a decrease in the overall attenuation after that response here. Other ways that we can have attenuation is, like I said, from reflection, but another way can be that the sound wave comes in, it interacts with the molecule, it heats that molecule, and it transitions that mechanical energy into thermal energy, and there's no longer the sound wave to continue on, or it will continue on at a lesser amplitude. That's another form of attenuation. And then finally, scattering. So if that sound wave comes in, interacts with something with a different impedance, and takes off at a new angle where it doesn't get reflected back, it's lost, we'll have a reduced amplitude here, and again, that's our attenuation. So attenuation is the reduction of energy of a beam, and it can come from reflection, scattering, or absorption into, as heat. How much is reflected, scattered, or absorbed is going to depend upon the medium itself. Reflection, like I said, is going to occur when the sound wave hits an interface with a different impedance and is reflected back towards the transducer. If it hits at 90 degrees, where my sound wave is coming in like so, it hits right at 90 degrees, and that is going to promote the highest percentage of reflection. If you hit an oblique intensity, it's going to still possibly cause, it's not going to reflect directly back. It will reflect kind of like a ping pong ball in a new direction. So this would be called oblique incidence, which would result in scatter, whereas this one example is perpendicular incidence, and it would respond with a true reflection or a straight echo. Okay. Now another one is if we have a high energy sound wave and it's coming in at an oblique incidence, and it goes from media 1 with a particular impedance. Remember, impedance is our stiffness, density, and propagation speed, or how fast sound travels. So my impedance 1 is up here, and I have a new material and it's got a different impedance down here. If the propagation speed, or the sound of impedance 2, is faster than impedance 1, it will not continue on in the same direction, but it will increase the angle of propagation. Now, if impedance 2 had a slower propagation speed than my material here on the in our media 1, then when it interacted with that, it would reduce the angle. Now, those changes in angulation as you're going from one media to the other media is called refraction. And an everyday life experience of this is when you have a nice cup of water. It's a nice clear cup. You fill the cup halfway. You stick a straw in that cup and you look at it from the side. Usually you'll see the straw almost looks disjointed at the level of the water. And that is because light, like sound, is traveling in wavelengths, and the light that's going through air has a different speed than the light that's going through water, and it makes it look disjointed because of refraction. So it's going to speed up or slow down, and that makes it look disconnected. And the same thing is going to happen in our sound waves in the body. So here's an example. If I have a sound wave coming in, its propagation speed is 1500 meters per second. It gets into a material that has a slower propagation speed of 900 meters per second. It comes in at 45 degrees. We might assume it would just continue on at 45 degrees, but because it's a slower propagation speed, you see that angle decrease. Here, same example, we have 1500 meters per second in our medium 1. Here in medium 2, we have 2000 meters per second, faster propagation speed. Anything that's transmitted through this oblique incidence is going to be refracted in a slightly higher angle. Okay. So that brings us to our range equation. Range equation is used to determine the travel time of the pulse, and we briefly spoke about this. And we said that there's a 13 microsecond rule. So for every, if I'm scanning just general soft tissue, because soft tissue has a propagation speed of 1540 meters per second, or 1.54 millimeters per microsecond, they've utilized that travel, or that speed, and they calculated that it would take 13 microseconds per centimeter of round trip travel. So if my sound travels 1 centimeter, it would take about 6.5 microseconds to get 1 centimeter into the tissue, another 6.5 microseconds to get back, and if we add up those two 6.5s, we get 13 microseconds, and that's where we get our our 13 microsecond rule, and that helps us with our range equation, and it helps our system understanding where echoes are coming from, or the depth at which echoes are coming from, so they can write those echoes appropriately on our display. Okay, that brings us to propagation speed errors, which can happen as we're saying all of our system operates off of the idea that sound always travels at 1540 meters per second, or 1.54 millimeters per microsecond. Now, if that were true, we would have no echoes back because our propagation speed throughout the whole body would be exactly the same. So really, our propagation speeds do vary within the body. Now, if they vary very slightly, it doesn't really affect our image very much. It just might cause a little bit of refraction. But if they have significant variability, like for instance, air has a propagation speed of about 300 meters per second versus soft tissue at 1540 meters per second. Those are significantly different propagation speeds, and because of that, we know that we don't see very well through air. And so anytime you're going through a material like air that has a very low propagation speed, or maybe like bone that has a propagation speed in the 4000s, you're going to have a significant deviation from the normal way that ultrasound generally acts. And so those can cause what we call propagation speed errors. So if, let's say, my sound is coming in at 1500, and let's say it hit an air pocket right here, a gas bubble, and that gas bubble has a propagation speed of 300. That sound's going to come in, and all of a sudden it's going to slow down significantly. And then it's going to speed up, and it's going to take a new refractive kind of turn. Well, by the time this hits something and echoes back, it has not been going the 1500 millimeters per, or pardon me, the 1500 meters per second that it's expected. So my machine might say, oh, you were gone a long time. And it would draw it a little bit deeper in our image than one might expect. Because really, it didn't go that far. It just slowed down for part of the distance. And so this would be drawn deeper into the image than it should. Now, on the other hand, if we run into bone, bone has a high propagation speed. So let's say it went through bone, it sped up through that bone, got all the way through this area really fast, and then it slowed down a little bit and changed its angle, but eventually it echoed back and it was gone for a certain length of time. Now, the length of time would have been less than expected for how long it traveled because it had this one instance of moving very quickly. So this one would be drawn closer to the top of the image than it should be. So that's our propagation speed errors that you can sometimes watch for. Okay, now as sonographers, you guys are all very familiar with your transducers. So here you see you have the curvilinear transducer. Here we have a linear, and here we have another linear. We are going to be able to use all of these in our vascular scanning. You might not think about the curvilinear as much, but when we're getting to those intra-abdominal organs, things like that, that's going to be very useful, as well as sometimes when we're looking at thicker body parts like maybe the thigh or the pelvis or something like that. And then these are going to be our workhorses of more of the shallow superficial transducers. And again, that's because we get these higher frequencies with these linear transducers, the lower frequencies with these curvilinears, and those we're going to have to select depending on how much penetration we're looking for with a particular exam. I mentioned a little bit about duty factor and how it related to biologic effects. So we know that sonography has the theoretic ability to cause biologic effects. It's been studied extensively. They study it in vitro, in test tubes. They study it in vivo in the body, and they study it in mammalian creatures, as well as epidemiologic studies where they study groups of people that have had ultrasounds, and then finally implant studies. And through all these studies, they've been able to produce some pretty significant effects, especially in mice. And so we know that there are some theoretic biologic effects with ultrasound. However, when we look at how we use ultrasound and we talk about the duty factor that I spoke of a couple slides back, we know that really when we're scanning a patient, our percentage of time on is going to be very, very low. So while the theoretic effects are there, our true biologic effects are pretty minimal. And they've really been demonstrated that there's really very unlikely to produce any biologic effects to patients in the way that we use ultrasound. However, it doesn't mean that we don't need to be considerate of some of these different things that we may or may not be able to control. The first thing is power. So power is the initial amount of electricity that's going to go to stimulate those piezoelectric elements to produce a sound wave. So the higher my power coming in, the higher my voltage amplitude will be. The higher the voltage amplitude will be when it reacts with that piezoelectric element, that element will then produce a mimicking sound wave to that voltage. So if I crank up my power, I'm also cranking up the amplitude of my sound wave. And as I do this, I have more intensity in that sound wave. Intensity is considered the amount of power in the beam divided by the beam area. So if I have a very small beam with a very high amount of power, I would have a lot of intensity, and that intensity would be more likely to cause a biological effect. If I have a low power or a very large beam, that decreases the intensity and reduces the probability of effect. Couple different types of effects that can occur because of ultrasound. First of all would be thermal effects. Thermal effects occur because of the bombardment of a cell with sound waves over time. The longer the time that that cell is bombarded with, the more likely it is to increase its thermal index. A thermal index is the measurement of how likely injury is due to heat. So the longer it's bombarded with sound wave, the higher the intensity of that sound wave, both going to contribute to the probability of increasing the thermal index. Now, most places say that the population that you need to be most considerate of with thermal index is going to be your fetal population. And obviously, the younger the fetus, the more sensitive it is. We can look at things like spatial peak, temporal average to assess thermal bioeffects. That kind of goes beyond the purpose of this lecture, but those are definitely ways that we can compare and contrast different types of intensities and how they may affect a patient. The second type of biologic effects are called mechanical. So these mechanical indexes, there's three different types. If you have a cell, there's one type that comes in, and this is called radiation wave, and it interacts with the cell, excites the cell for a moment, and then the cell goes back to normal and nothing comes of it. So it's mechanical because it just moves the cell. Okay. Another kind is a shear wave, where the sound comes in and it actually propagates into the cell and causes a wave throughout the cytoplasm in the cell. And that wave can disrupt organelles. So this one's a little bit more dangerous. And then thirdly, there's cavitation. Now there's two different kinds of cavitation. So cavitation, transient cavitation comes in, it interacts with an air bubble. And when it interacts with that air bubble, it excites the bubble, which causes the bubble to get big. And then over time, the bubble just decreases in size and goes back to normal. So the effect is transient. On the other, non-transient, the cavitation comes in, or pardon me, the sound wave comes in, interacts with an air bubble. That bubble expands and contracts so violently that it ends up exploding. And when it explodes, it releases very, very high levels of heat. So with our mechanical index, because of those high levels of heat, mainly from just cavitation reactions, they can cause an elevated risk of biologic effects. Now in mice, they found that with some of these high levels, they were getting effects in areas where there was lots of air. So places like the lung or the GI tract, they were seeing that the mice would have bleeds in those. So cavitation, again, it's a very real possibility. We watch for that with the mechanical index, which demonstrates how likely there is for a bioeffect to occur based on what settings you have on your equipment. All right, moving on a little bit farther into our basic principles here, our resolutions. I talked about resolutions just a little bit, and I said if we're looking at two items, top to bottom of our screen, and we're able to demonstrate them as two separate items, that describes our axial resolution. And our axial resolution was based on our spatial pulse length. So the smaller our pulse was, the more easy it could get in between these items, have a response, and create an echo. The bigger our pulse was, the more likely it would be to go through both items, have one reaction, and create an item that looks like one entity. Okay. All right, so that's our axial resolution, controlled entirely by spatial pulse length, and our spatial pulse length is controlled mainly by our frequency. So improve axial resolution by increasing frequency and decreasing spatial pulse length. Now, another important type of resolution is our lateral resolution. Lateral resolution is the assessment of the system's ability to demonstrate two items side by side. Now, this has to do with something I haven't talked any about, but it's due to the width of the beam. Now, as sound propagates through tissue, it has this tendency to go narrowest in one area and then get broader and broader and broader from there. Now, because that happens, the deeper you are in anatomy, typically the harder it is for that sound wave to squeeze between two items and draw them as two separate entities, and so they start lumping them together as one. Now, that doesn't mean you have no control over this, however, because when I have two laterally placed items and I want to control the narrowest area of my beam, I simply do that by setting my focus. So when I set my focus, my beam will make it so that's the narrowest area of my beam, and then beyond there, it's going to gradually broaden indefinitely. So by adjusting my focus to the area that I want the best lateral resolution, I'm going to help maintain that resolution. If I were to move my focus down here, it would change my beam so that it started out the same size, it broadened, and then it narrowed at the focus, and then it broadened dramatically afterwards. So here would be my best level of lateral resolution. Now finally, I was going to talk about elevational resolution. Elevational resolution, if we look at this transducer here, we see that while we look at our image as if they're a finite, a very, very thin laser slice of the body, they really aren't. All of our transducers, as you guys are scanning, you see are really usually formed as almost like a matrix across the face of your transducer. So what you're really doing is you're collecting a layer of information, putting it over another layer of information, over another and over another, and then basically stacking them and creating one two-dimensional image. Well, because there is an inherent thickness in this, there's going to be an inherent thickness in the image that is going to be compressed on top of one another. So if, say, I had a cyst right here in this area of tissue, but I had liver wall in this area of tissue, in this one slice that's being represented, I might see a cyst with quite a few echoes because it's also demonstrating the wall from here on top of the cyst. And that is your elevational or slice thickness resolution. And one of the best ways that you can affect that is not only with your focus as well. All right, now to Doppler principles. So Doppler principles basically operate off the effect that if I emit a sound wave into a body part and it encounters, let's say, a red blood cell, and that red blood cell is moving toward the sound wave. When they come together, it's almost like a car crash head-on. They're going to smash together. And when they smash together, that sound wave is going to be reflected back. But because this was incoming and it crashed into it, it's going to come back at a higher frequency, lower wavelength than it was emitted. Now, when my system detects that not only was my sound gone for a certain length of time, but it came back as a change in frequency, we're going to call that a Doppler shift. Now, in this case, because my frequency was lower and then went higher, I'm going to call that a positive Doppler shift. Now, on the other hand, if I sent out a sound wave and I had a red blood cell moving away from me, this sound wave would have to stretch out and run to reach that red blood cell. And when it did finally interact, it would reflect, but the sound that was reflected and coming back would have a lower frequency, longer wavelength than the initial sound. Now, my system would recognize, okay, I've sent sound out, I received an echo from this depth, but my echo is at a lower frequency, therefore I have had a negative Doppler shift. All right, now if I just had a stationary reflector, sound comes in, interacts, it might get echoed back, but it would not change the frequency. So in this, you'd have no Doppler shift. Now there's multiple different ways that you can talk about or demonstrate a Doppler shift. You can demonstrate Doppler shifts with color, as you guys have all seen. You know, a beautiful carotid ultrasound, you see a nice red hue to the carotid, and that would be because the sound waves are moving up toward the transducer. Well, maybe you're looking at the jugular vein, and now you see it as blue. That would be because the red blood cells are moving away from the transducer, so the sound is having to chase it. It's decreasing its frequency and resulting in a negative Doppler shift. Now, the other way that we can demonstrate Doppler shifts is on our spectral Dopplers. So here and here you see your spectral Dopplers. Now this spectral Doppler is showing what we call a systolic upstroke. Systolic upstroke happens when I have a vessel and all of my arteries are controlled basically by my heart on one end and by my arterioles on the other end. And we'll get to this more in depth in a moment. My heart is the pump. Every time my heart goes into systole, it's going to contract and it's going to push blood forward. So when I say that we have a systolic upstroke on one of my spectral Dopplers, you're going to be looking for this systolic upstroke. It says this red blood cell is moving forward, 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 and then it gets to a peak. Now, you're going to see it start to drop. Now, you might think of this as it's slowing down or as it reversing, but it's not reversing. This heart stopped squeezing and now it's still flowing forward, but it's flowing forward at a slower speed, and that's why you see it taper off here. Then you happen to see this little reversal. Now, this can happen in some instances, but not all, as you look at this example. When you have this little reversal, that means that there's some sort of pressure up ahead that is exerting so much pressure that when the heart isn't pushing blood forward, this pressure ahead is actually causing it to push back. And that's what this reversal is. Right here, my red blood cell started going forward, 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 forward. Heart released in systole, started diastole. The speed of that forward flow slowed, but forward flow continued. And then all of a sudden, the pressure up ahead was so great that it pushed back against the blood. And for this little moment in time, the blood flow reversed. Now, then something sort of fantastic happens. And this pent up stored energy in our vessels called the Windkessel effect kicks in, and the vessel contracts, squeezing again, pushing that blood flow forward again. And so you see what we call our end diastole pushing that blood flow through forward again. Now, this would be in a higher resistance arterial system. And I mentioned there were two components very involved in this process, the heart, which was the pump, and the arterial, which provided the resistance. Now, if this arterial decided to go ahead and open wide open like a floodgate, and it's going to let everything flow through, you would no longer see this resistance that would cause blood to move backwards. You'd see something more like this. The heart beats, you get forward systolic motion. The heart enters diastole. Some of that, it releases some of the pressure it was applying. So the speed of the blood flow continues moving forward, but it slows down. And it continues going slowly forward because there is no major resistance. And then the heart beats again, it goes forward, slows down, goes forward, slows down, but never do you see this reversal because there's nothing pushing back against it. So this is what we call a higher resistance waveform, and this is what we call a lower resistance waveform. Now, when we look at our waveforms here, you'll see something called a window. A window is sort of this opened up area beneath the information on your spectral Doppler. Now, if you were to have a lot of turbulence or a lot of forward-backward motion of blood, or if you were to have a really wide gate that was getting interference from the side, that would fill in this window. But when you have a very nice narrow window, or excuse me, a narrow gate in the center of your vessel, you should have a nice open window if you don't have any turbulence. If you have a big wide gate or a gate that's set out towards the vessel wall, you're going to get interference and it's going to fill in that window. If we look at what we're really seeing when we talk about these spectral waveforms and Doppler shift, we talked about how when sound comes in, our sound wave will come in, and if it interacts with something moving toward it, it's going to crash in there, come back at a higher frequency. My system's going to detect a positive Doppler shift that says something from this area was moving forward. Now, if I were to take that information, my system with a spectral Doppler is simply plotting that on a graph. So it would say, ooh, I got forward motion of this speed here. And then if it was getting a lot more of that forward motion, and some of those velocities were indicating it was running from maybe 20 to 50 centimeters per second. So this would be lots of blood flow coming back. And if it took a Doppler shift off of all of those, could determine the velocities of each one of those blood cells. And then it's going to plot it on the graph, and it's going to say, hey, I had readings from velocities of 20 to 50 at this time, and it draws the line. One moment in time later, or the next pulse, it detects 20 to 50 again, and it plots it. Now let's say up here, it detects just during systole, the blood gets pushed through faster. That's going to cause an even greater Doppler shift, but it's only the only variety in Doppler shift, or the only variety in signal, is from 75 to 80. And so that's a very narrow line. Okay, so it's simply plotting variations in velocity that it's detecting through Doppler shifts over time. Now, if we go down here and we look at this, you'd say, oh my goodness, there's a lot of Doppler shift at these vessels, or pardon me, at these velocities because it's very bright. But there is some Doppler shift in these lower velocities, and there's even some reversal of Doppler shift. What is going on here? Well, if I have a wider gate, then, or if I have blood flow, then I'm getting slow velocities at the periphery and higher velocities in the center, and they're all coming back at the same moment in time, it's going to draw my line like this, which would then close what we call the window. Okay. Maybe I even have my gate so wide open that it's getting interference from the vein next door. That's when I start seeing these venous signals. Now, if you have any questions on spectral and how it's produced, it was a difficult thing for me to kind of grasp for a while, and then I realized, oh, they're just teeny tiny marks that make this overall form. And once you realize they're just, each mark is one moment in time, each mark represents all the velocities detected at that moment in time, it becomes much clearer. But if you need any additional help on that, please let me know, because it was not an easy concept for me. Okay, a little bit more Doppler terminology, aliasing. So one of the things that we talked about early off in this lecture was pulse repetition period, and that meant I'd have my on time and then I'd have my listening time. And the longer my listening time was, the longer it was till I could produce a new pulse. Well, one of the defects that happens if I have a really long listening time is that they say it's inadequate sampling. So there's a lot of information out there, but because I'm only taking a sample here and here and a little bit later and a little bit later, I'm not getting enough samples to give me an accurate spectral image. And what you can see is something that looks like this, where it looks like it's wrapping around. And the reason it's wrapping around is because it has inadequate numbers of samples. So we call this the Nyquist limit. The Nyquist limit is 1/2 of the pulse repetition frequency, or which is related to the pulse repetition period. So my pulse repetition frequency is the number of pulses created in 1 second. Now, if I have a longer pulse repetition period, I'm going to have fewer cycles created in 1 second. So as I have longer PRP, if this increases, my pulse repetition frequency, the number of cycles per second, is going to decrease. And if my PRF, or my Nyquist limit, is 1/2 of my PRF, then my Nyquist limit is going to also decrease. Now, why does that matter? My Nyquist limit is the number at which, if I exceed that velocity determined by my Nyquist limit, it will cause inadequate sampling, which will result in aliasing. So if I am scanning very, very deep, I have increased my PRP, which reduced my PRF. When I reduce my PRF, I'm not sampling as frequently. If I'm not sampling frequently enough, I'm not getting an accurate picture of what motion is occurring. That results in going beyond the Nyquist limit, which causes aliasing or wraparound. And it can occur in spectral Doppler, or you see on this sample, this is a color indicator. It can also occur in our color Doppler. So the way to correct this would be to increase your pulse repetition frequency, or increase your scale, or decrease your baseline. All right. So that brings us to our controls. So controls, you guys are probably all very familiar. I'm sorry if I'm boring you with any of this. Our B mode controls are our overall gain. There are time gain compensation. There are focal zone or focal spot. There are frequency, our depth, our tissue harmonics, and our spatial compounding. Those are all things we can change on our B mode or black and white mode imaging to adjust or improve our image. When we come to color mode, we can adjust our gate. So when we look at a vessel, we place our gate in our vessel. We can either make it wider or we can make it narrower. We can also adjust our angle of our gate. The other thing that we can adjust is our PRF or our scale. So we can, if we want to improve our Nyquist limit, we would increase our PRF, and that would help prevent our aliasing. Same thing with our scale. We can turn our color gain up or down, which means when we turn our color gain up, it does more with less less signal. So if I'm not getting a lot of information back from my equipment, by turning up my color gain, it's going to increase what it's doing with the input it's getting. And then we can invert it where we take red to blue or blue to red. With our spectral mode that we just looked at, we can adjust that PRF or that scale. That's going to affect our Nyquist limit. We can add spectral gain to make all of those lines on that spectrum a little bit brighter or darker. We can adjust our range gate just like we could with color. We can change our angle correction. We can adjust our sweep speed, change our baseline, and invert it so what's on top goes to bottom or vice versa. Artifacts are going to be very similar to the same artifacts that we have with our B mode. You'll see here, these are all B mode images, and just realize they can occur with our Doppler images as well. But when we have reverberation, that's when our sound comes in. It goes through usually an anechoic structure, and it gets stuck like a ping pong ball, reverberating between walls of that anechoic structure before it finally gets back to the transducer. So you see it like this ring down or reverberation effect, drawing lines deeper than they should be because it's been bouncing off the walls and didn't come back when it should have come back. Another type of reverberation is comet tail, which can happen when you have two very closely spaced echogenic structures. And sometimes you will see that in vessels as you're seeing here, or if there's air or something like that, or gallbladder clips, things like that. Another type of artifact is shadowing. This comes from attenuation or absorption. So all of my sound wave comes in. This right here is one of the vertebral bones, and here's our vertebral artery. So our sound comes in, interacts with that bone. That bone happens to absorb all of the sound or reflect it. As you see, it has a bright reflection here. So it reflects and it absorbs, and it has no sound to go beyond it. So it attenuated the whole sound beam. There's nothing left to go back and grab information, and so you just see shadowing. Oppositely here's a cyst. We know that cysts are anechoic structures. Our sound wave has been getting attenuated, sending back echoes all the way throughout this liver tissue. But once it gets to this cyst, there's no attenuation occurring. So while there's attenuation occurring at all levels in here, because there's no attenuation occurring in this cyst, the sound wave that reaches the back wall of this cyst has a higher intensity than any other areas on the image, and that's going to give you your enhancement. You can also have grading lobes, which are just lobes that leave outside the beam where the beam should be gathering information, and it creates artifactual information in your image that shouldn't be there because it took it from somewhere else and grabbed it and placed it on your image. Mirror image, on the other hand, is a little bit more complicated. What happens with the mirror image is your sound wave comes in, we'll use this, your sound wave comes in, it interacts with something, and then it interacts with the highly reflective or specular reflector. And when it does that, it bounces back, and it has taken an additional time for that sound to go interact with the anatomy, scatter, bounce off of the reflector, and then return back as an echo. And because it took additional time and returned from a slightly different angle, it will draw the information deeper and lateral to where the particular anatomy actually existed. All right, with that, we're going to get into a little bit of memorization here with our vascular anatomy. This might take some practice or some time, so don't be alarmed. Don't feel like you're going to get it in a day. Keep looking back at your vascular anatomy, and just repetition helps. So first thing we're going to talk about is the anatomy of the vessels. All vessels, arteries, and veins are made of tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica adventitia. The tunica adventitia is the outer layer. It's composed of mostly connective tissue, nerves, fibers, and small vessel capillaries that feed the vessel themselves, called the vasovasorum. It's in contact with the surrounding tissue. Now, that's going to be common to both of our veins and our arteries. Now, internal to that, we have our tunica media. Tunica media, I think media starts with an M, so does muscle. This is our muscular layer. Here's where there's a big difference. With our arteries, it has a very thick muscular layer. That's what allows our arteries to be so pulsatile and to handle that. Whereas in veins, it's a very thin tunica media layer, which allows them to be very flexible and compressible. And then our tunica intima is our innermost layer. This has an epithelial cell lining with connective tissue beneath it, connecting it to the tunica media. This is the one that can be a little bit more permeable and things like that. But the layers are the same in arteries and veins. It's just that really the biggest difference is that a much thicker tunica media in our arteries. If we look at further arterial anatomy, we talk about arteries. They really go from large arteries, which would be the most elastic arteries in like the aorta. So the aorta is a large artery. Off of it branches what we call the ABCs, where our aorta is an A. Then we have our right brachiocephalic, our left common carotid, and our left subclavian. So aorta, A, B, brachiocephalic, C, left carotid, S is your subclavian. So here's our ABCs, and they're considered our large arteries. The final set of large arteries are the iliacs. So as our aorta transverses through the abdomen, eventually gets to about the umbilicus area, it's going to bifurcate into the iliacs, and those common iliac arteries will also be considered large arteries. So those are only the large arteries in the body. So in our arterial system, we go from heart to large arteries. Then we go to our medium arteries, which are going to have slightly less tunica media than the large arteries, but will still have a significant amount. Then it goes to the medium, and then the medium branches off into the smalls, and then the smalls are going to have something called the arterioles, which are considered the stopcocks of this vascular system. So this would be like when you're using your garden hose, if you have one of the sprayers that you can open up the valve and it sprays, and then you close the valve and it stops spraying. The arterioles open and close to a certain extent in response to feedback from the nervous system that tells it what the tissue bed is needing as far as oxygen and nutrients. So for example, if I am very, very cold, my body says you need to preserve all of your blood flow for your internal organs. So my arterioles would constrict, and they would cause less blood to be needed at the muscular level of my fingers. So my fingers might become very cold, they might look a little bit pale, things like that. Now, if it's a really hot day and I'm working with my hands a lot and my muscles are using up a lot of oxygen, my nervous system or receptors in my hands are going to recognize that, send feedback to my brain. My brain is then going to cause my arterioles to dilate, open up, produce more blood flow to the area, and that's where you see those pink, warm, even swollen hands. It's all dependent on the stopcocks or the arterioles of the system. So in our arteries, we go from heart to large vessels, aorta, and its cranial branches and the iliacs, then to our medium arteries, then to our smaller arteries, then to our arterioles. Now, once the arterioles will then branch out into our capillaries, which is where the oxygen and nutrient exchange occurs. So our capillaries are considered are the smallest vessels in the body. They only measure about large enough for one red blood cell to travel through at a time. They have very thin walls of endothelial cells that create a basement membrane that's highly permeable. And that permeability is what allows for oxygen and nutrients to be exchanged between the tissue in the artery. And so in the arterial system, you're dropping off oxygen and picking up carbon dioxide and waste products. The permeability depends on tissue bed. So you might have heard something about, you know, placental barriers or blood-brain barriers. So just because the blood can get to that area doesn't mean that the capillaries are always going to be as permeable as one might like. And that actually is a life-saving protection component of our body to prevent certain things from getting into our brain or to a baby. All right, now, so we went from heart to large artery to medium to small to arterioles to capillaries. And at that capillary level, that's where our oxygen waste exchange occurs. Then that capillary is going to move into the venous side. And the first part of the venous side is going to be our venule. So as we talked about earlier, our venous side has the same structure as our arterial side. It's just a much thinner tunica media. So it goes from capillary into our very smallest veins, which are our venules. These are only about 20 microns in diameter, meaning they only have room to fit about they're just a little over twice the size of our capillaries, and they could basically move 2 red blood cells at a moment. Then those veins will go up, or pardon me, the venules will all, what we call anastomose, come together, and they will create bigger veins. And bigger veins anastomose, and they create medium-sized veins, which anastomose to create larger veins, and those larger veins are ultimately going to dump into the heart. So our small to medium veins are usually very small, 1 to 10 millimeters. These are all veins except the portal vein, vena cava, and the main branches of the neck. They have that thin tunica media and a thick tunica adventitia, which makes them very sturdy but compressible. All these medium veins are going to dump into our large veins, which consist of the portal vein of our liver and the superior and inferior the superior and the inferior vena cava. And those vena cavas are going to dump into the right atria of the heart. So this brings us to one of the differences between the arteries and veins, and that is that veins can have valves. And so with the exception of our vena cava in our chest and in our abdomen, most of our veins do have valves to prevent the backflow of blood. So there's no heart pumping blood through the veins. We're really dependent on our muscles doing that. So when we walk, our calf muscles are flexing, and that's pushing blood up towards our heart. And once blood gets past a certain area, if we stopped walking, that blood would run right back down to our feet again, and that would not be very helpful. And so because of that, our venous system has this double layer of tunica intima that kind of folds over and creates these valves. So when that blood does try to go downward because of gravity and a lack of motion, those valves will stop it from going too far. Now, if you have somebody that has incompetent valves or maybe are congenitally missing some valves, those are people that are going to be more likely to have significant varicose veins. So that's kind of what our valves help prevent. The area behind the little leaflets are called our sinuses here, and can be an area where blood clot can trap. All right, our circulatory system. So we already kind of talked about the process that goes here, but on our arterial side, if we tracked our circulatory system from venous side, you see the inferior vena cava coming up here, our superior vena cava coming up here. Both of them are going to dump into the right atria here of our heart. Now, when my heart goes into diastole, this right ventricle is going to expand, decreasing the pressure in that ventricle compared to what's in the atria. And when we have a pressure decrease down here, the blood is going to flow from the atria into that ventricle. Now you'll see these valves that they can be known, this is the tricuspid valve, or sometimes they'll call the endocushion valves. these will prevent when that heart squeezes from pushing blood back into that atria. So instead, when my heart goes into systole, it squeezes, it's going to push my blood into my pulmonary vein here. My pulmonary vein is going to deliver that blood out to my right and my left lungs. It's going to wash over those lungs, and you're going to have the waste oxygen exchange. So it's going to drop off waste in the lungs, pick up oxygen from the lungs, and then return through my pulmonary arteries to my left atria. Once it gets into the left atria, when the ventricle relaxes during diastole, it decreases the pressure in that left ventricle. The blood flows from right ventricle, or pardon me, flows from left atria to left ventricle. When the heart squeezes in systole, it's going to contract, pushing that blood out the aortic valve into the aorta, and then we have our ABCs: aorta, brachiocephalic, left carotid, left subclavian, and then down the descending aorta. Now, once it gets out into the aorta, then it's going to branch off into the medium arteries. These would be things like the femoral arteries, the axillary arteries, things like that. Those branch into smaller arteries. Those smaller arteries provide lots of blood flow, but the arterioles at the end of the smaller arteries act to expand or contract the arteries in the area to move more or less blood to a tissue. The capillaries actually deliver that blood to the tissue and allow permeability to transmit oxygen waste exchange across the border. Then the capillaries are going to dump into the venules. The venules now have deoxygenated blood. Multiple venules are going to anastomose to create small veins. Small veins anastomose to create medium veins. Medium veins anastomose to create the superior and inferior vena cava. And those superior and inferior vena cava dump into the right atria of the heart, and it goes through the whole process again. Part 3. Now we're going to take a look at the individual vessels of different parts of the body. Our cerebrovascular anatomy, this is cerebro for brain, vascular for vessels. So our cerebrovascular anatomy really starts at our common carotids. Now we talked about our aorta and how that was the A, and we said that we have the brachiocephalic on the right, but then we have the left carotid on the left and then the left subclavian. So where is my right carotid? Well, that brachiocephalic bifurcates into subclavian and right carotid. So on the right, I have brachiocephalic, and then off that comes my right carotid, whereas on the left, my carotid comes right off the aortic arch. Okay. They're both going to ascend the neck laterally, just lateral to the thyroid cartilage, and they will bifurcate into the internal and external carotid arteries, just about the mandibular area, the posterior mandibular angle. So here you can look at this image. You see the left coming right off of the aorta, and here's the right coming off of that brachiocephalic. Up here towards that jaw, that's where our bifurcation is going to occur. Now, the internal carotid arteries are really going to go in and they're going to feed the brain. And because the brain needs a lot of blood flow to operate, it's going to provide very little resistance to blood flow, meaning that those arterioles are not going to constrict the blood flow very much. And so when we look at vessels that are feeding the internal carotids, or that the internal carotid is feeding itself, those are going to have very low resistant waveforms. Okay, it needs lots of blood. It's not going to cause any resistance. Okay, so the internal carotid provides most of the circulation necessary to the brains and the eyes. It is lateral to the ECA and also demonstrates a much lower resistance than the ECA. It has no extracranial branches, meaning you can't see it branch outside of the head. Now, once it gets into the cranium, it can branch, and it branches into the petrous, cavernous, and cerebral portions. Now, for most of us, unless we're doing a lot of intracranial Doppler, which is not very common, this might not or not very common in our area, this might not be that helpful. What is important is to understand the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis here is fed by the vertebral arteries and by our internal carotids via the cerebral artery. And the reason this is so important is this is the greatest collateral in the body. So any sort of time that our vessels produce a workaround because of some sort of stenosis or blockage, occlusion, anything else, it's called it's called a collateral. Now, this is a natural collateral. It occurs without any abnormality existing, and yet it allows us to function even when there is a significant abnormality in the brain. So the cerebral portions of my internal carotid artery come in and they actually create the middle cerebral artery off of which the circle of Willis basically operates. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this, the circle of Willis in a bit, so I won't focus too much on it just yet. Now, the external carotid artery really goes and feeds a lot more of the muscles in our face and external scalp and external components of our anatomy. So it can feed the thyroid, the lingual or tongue, facial muscles, occipital muscles, auricle muscles by the ear, or auricle areas by the ear, pharyngeal, maxillary, and temporal areas. Now, because these are mostly muscular, we know that the blood flow requirements of muscles are highly dependent on their metabolism at the time. So right now, I've been talking for so long, I probably have pretty high blood needs in my facial muscles. But if you're just normally, you know, just having a normal day, you would probably not need a lot of blood flow to these facial muscles. And therefore, our external carotid arteries typically have a much higher resistance than our internals. Okay, so you see it much more resistance. It comes much closer to stopping. It may even reverse, whereas our internal carotids are very low resistance, allowing flow easily through all the time. Okay, now we also have vertebral arteries that branch off of our subclavians lateral to our carotids. So these are going to ascend or move up through the neck, through the intervertebral foramina of the cervical spine. And they enter into the cranium back by the foramen ovale, by the foramen magnum, and they enter and then they join, the two vertebral arteries join to produce the basilar artery. Now, once they become the basilar artery, here's our vertebrals coming together. They join the basilar artery. They have a few branches coming off of them, like the pontine and the arteries, but ultimately they come up from the posterior aspect of the brain and they meet with some of the branches of that circle of Willis, and then they are a part of the circle of Willis. So ultimately, when we look at that circle of Willis, we know that the internal carotid artery came into the brain, and that internal carotid artery gave rise to the anterior cerebral arteries that you see here. It gave rise to the middle cerebral arteries that we see here, and the posterior communicating arteries that we see here. The vertebral arteries came together, created that basilar artery that completed that ultimate circle of Willis. And then a couple communications at the anterior circle of Willis form called the anterior choroidal. Okay. All right, so this is just another example of our circle of Willis. Here we have our anterior communicating, those came off of our, anterior cerebral, those came off of our internal carotids. Middle cerebral came off of our internal carotids, and then our posterior communicating came off of our internal carotids, and then our vertebral anastomose to create the basilar. Now, one of the great things of this is if I happened to have an occlusion here in my middle cerebral, it would be cause limited damage because all of the blood flow would be provided by the other vessels that were connected in that circle. All right, now the cerebrovascular anatomy of the cranium. So how do we got the blood all up into our brain and all up into our face, and now how do we get it out? Well, we get it out through the external jugular vein. This returns blood from the cranial cavity, the face, the neck, and it empties into the subclavian. We also have the internal jugular that's going to drain blood from the face and neck as well. And these are right next to your carotid, so it's really easy to, when scanning, to accidentally transition from a carotid to a jugular, but remember, these will compress, your carotids will not. Okay, both of these are going to dump into your subclavian, and just like the vertebral artery runs through those intervertebral foramina of the C-spine, our vertebral vein follows those arteries very closely. All right, collaterals, like I mentioned, collaterals form to bypass pathology. However, our one natural collateral is our circle of Willis, and it is the best collateral in the body. That brings us to our aortic arch. So we already talked about our heart. We talked about our aorta a little bit. The ascending aorta is this component moving up. Ascending is moving up. So this is our ascending aorta. It's its largest area right here coming off the heart. It's about 3 centimeters in diameter. It begins at that aortic valve within the heart, and then it continues up and to the left, crossing the trachea. And we know that this is where we get our ABCs branches. So we have our aorta is our A, our B is our right brachiocephalic, our C is our left carotid, and our S is our left subclavian. Now, where did our carotid and subclavian go? Well, they came off of, on the right, they came off of our brachiocephalic. Then we transition into the transverse aorta, which is the arch, and then our descending aorta, which can be broken into thoracic components, and then once it dives below the diaphragm, then it would be our abdominal components. Okay, if we're looking at those upper extremity arteries, these can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes, but so it may take looking at them once in a while to remind you where everything is at. But we talked about, especially on the right side, we started with that brachiocephalic artery, and that brachiocephalic artery gave rise to the carotid, and then it turned into the subclavian artery. Now, that subclavian artery came over, and when it got to the edge of the clavicle, it becomes the axillary artery, where it goes through the armpit. Okay. So at the end of that first rib and the clavicle, it becomes the axillary. Axillary as in your axilla or armpit. It continues through that axilla until it until it becomes the brachial artery. Now, when I forget what brachial artery is, remember on babies in CPR, you put your hand underneath their armpit and you get their brachial pulse. So the axillary artery turns into the brachial artery. And it is going to continue down the arm here until about 1 inch below the elbow joint in this antecubital space. And then it is going to branch into the profunda brachii and terminate into the radial and ulnar arteries. Now, radial is going to run on your thumb side. Ulnar is going to run on your ulnar or your pinky side. So we have brachiocephalic turns into our subclavian after the carotid comes off. Subclavian turns into the axillary. Axillary turns into the brachial. brachial goes through the antecubital space and turns into your radial and ulnar. Now, when we get into the forearm, you see that the radial is going along the thumb side, the ulnar is going along the pinky side. They are going to anastomose in the palmar areas and in the digital arteries. So they're, fortunately, all of the forearm is basically named for where it's at. You have the ulnar on the ulnar side, the radial on the radial side, the palmar goes across the palm, and then the digital arteries go out to the digits. And here you see it all together again, so you can see it right off the aortic arch, all the way subclavian, axillary, brachial. Then we have our radial and ulnar. Then we have our palmar and digital. Now, if we got that blood out there, we need to know how to get it back. And so we got to look at our venous system. And we really look at our venous system backwards, right? Because it's picking up the blood and it's anastomosing into larger and larger veins till it gets back to the heart. So here we're going to start with our digital arteries and our palmar arteries. Those are going to anastomose and they're going to create our radial and ulnar veins. I'm sorry, I called the digital and palmar arteries, I meant digital and palmar veins. They are going to create the radial and ulnar veins, which are going to anastomose. They're going to come up in the brachial veins, axillary veins, then into our subclavian vein, and then into our superior vena cava. Now, cephalic vein is a little bit different. The veins that I talked about were just deep veins. Those ran along next to the artery, and usually for every artery there would be two veins. So for every radial artery, for the radial artery, I'd have two radial veins. For the axillary artery, I'd have two axillary veins, and so on and so forth. Now, there is also in the arm, as well as in the legs, there's a superficial version, or a superficial vascular system as well. So in this particular superficial vascular system, it's going to wind around the radial artery, or pardon me, the radial artery and vein in the forearm, and this is called our cephalic. So our cephalic comes up and it's very much more superficial because it's a superficial vein. It's going to continue along the border of the biceps. I try and remember this one by being cephalic. It's more out towards the periphery of my arm. So if I lift my arm, it's towards my head. So that's my cephalic. So my cephalic ultimately comes in, joins with the brachial, and creates the subclavian. Okay, so we have our deep system, which matches our arterial system, and then we have our superficial system that's going to consist of that cephalic as well as a basilic vein. So here's our basilic vein, and you see that where our cephalic is towards the latter part, or excuse me, towards the lateral part of our arm, our basilic vein would be towards our medial part of our arm. And it is going to anastomose with the brachial arteries, and then it anastomose with the cephalic vein, and then it's going to create the subclavian vein. And again, I slipped an artery in there and I apologize. No arteries right now. All right. So that brings us back out of the arm. One of the things I find that's really useful when you're studying your vessels anywhere, but especially in the arm or the legs, is really to do some flow charting. So you could, if you're doing the venous side, you might say, okay, my venous side of the upper extremity, I start in my digital veins. That blood flow anastomoses into my palmar veins. My palmar veins then feed the radial and the ulnar veins. Those radial and ulnar veins are going to come up and they are going to anastomose and create the brachial vein. Then that brachial vein is going to have the cephalic dump into it, and it's going to have the basilic dump into it, and then it's going to become the subclavian vein. So sometimes things like this, or just looking over the images over and over again, or the diagrams, can be really helpful. Or if you haven't done one for a while, go review your veins before you start an exam. It can be really helpful. All right, so moving on out of the upper extremity anatomy, we're going to go take a quick look at the descending aorta. So our descending aorta in our thoracic cavity, we don't look at that much because we have so much trouble scanning through air. Just know that the branches include bronchial arteries, which are going to fill, as you can imagine, they're going to provide blood flow to the bronchi. And then we have the esophageal, which is obviously going to feed the esophagus, phrenic, which would feed the diaphragm, intercostal, which is going to feed the ribs, and then subcostal, which would feed below the ribs. But then once we get down into our abdominal aorta, that's when we can really visualize a lot of this vascular anatomy. So our abdominal aorta is going to consist of once it transverses through the crux of the diaphragm, it comes down, and it relatively quickly has its first branch. And this first branch is called the celiac axis, or the celiac trunk. The celiac trunk is right here, and it gives rise to three very important vessels. It gives rise to the right hepatic, the splenic, and the left gastric. Now, the right hepatic, or the hepatic, goes right into the liver and provides all of the oxygenated blood to the liver. Now, out of all the blood supplied to the liver, it only provides 30%, but it's the only blood supply that's oxygenated. Okay, then we have the splenic artery, which goes right over to the spleen, and then we have the left gastric artery, which goes up and over toward the stomach. Our next branch just below that celiac trunk or celiac axis is our superior mesenteric artery. This is an artery that comes off right off the front of the aorta, and it dives down and follows the trail of the aorta. Now, this superior mesenteric artery is going to have many, many, many branches. This is going to branch off and feed the mesentery that goes to the bowel, and ultimately is going to feed the intestines. Most all of the small intestines and quite a large bit of the large intestines. So the blood flow through the superior mesenteric artery is going to be very significant. Now, a little bit lower and much smaller and harder to appreciate on our ultrasound scans is our inferior mesenteric artery. This usually arises just a little bit above the aortic bifurcation before it bifurcates into the iliac arteries, and it supplies a lot of the large intestine. But again, it's much smaller and harder to appreciate on ultrasound. A couple more of our arteries that are good. Now we're looking at the arteries that are paired and that they are going to come off the sides of our aorta rather than, as we were looking, coming off our anterior. So on our anterior, we have our celiac trunk, we have our SMA, and we have our IMA. Now, laterally off the sides of our aorta, we're going to have our renal branches. So they're coming here and here. They arise just below the superior mesenteric. Oh, excuse me. Here's my renal branches. They arise just below the superior mesenteric artery. The renal artery on the right is slightly longer than the renal artery on the left, and that's simply because it has to cross over the IVC rather than going directly into the organ. So it's always important to remember that our aorta is to the left of the IVC. Now, the next paired set of arteries or branches are going to be our testicular or ovarian arteries, also known as our gonadal arteries. And these are very small, and they come off the lateral aspects of the aorta just below the renal arteries. Then we have similarly, we have the lumbar arteries that come off more posteriorly of the aorta. Very difficult for us to see these, and they're usually in 4 pairs. And then the middle sacral artery that rises just above the bifurcation off the posterior aorta. So again, it's a little bit difficult for us to see. So the ones we usually focus on the most are going to be our celiac trunk and its branches, our SMA, our renals, and our IMA if we can see it. Okay, now once our aorta gets down to about the umbilicus area, it's going to bifurcate into our common iliac. So here's our right common iliac, and here's our left common iliac as they enter into the pelvis. As they transverse through the pelvis, that common iliac is going to bifurcate into the internal iliac and the external iliac. That internal iliac is going to go and feed a lot of the gonad and pelvic organs, whereas the external iliac is going to continue down toward the leg. Once it crosses the inguinal ligament, then we're going to refer to that same vessel as the common femoral artery. Our common femoral artery comes down and then it bifurcates into the superficial femoral artery and profunda. All right, now just like we had arteries in the pelvis, we need to have veins in the pelvis. And so our pelvic veins are going to really be fed from the legs. So if I have my legs coming up, I have my my common femoral vein come in. Once it crosses the inguinal limit, it becomes my external iliac vein. Once it joins or anastomoses with my internal iliac vein, it becomes the common iliac vein. Once the two common iliac veins come together, then they're going to become the IVC. Same thing about veins in the abdomen. Our aorta was pumping all this blood out. How do we get it back to the heart? So our IVC was created by those common iliac veins, and it is going to course up through the abdomen, and its major tributaries are going to consist of the renal veins, as you see here and here. Now, in this case, my left renal vein is much longer than my right renal vein because it has to transverse over the aorta. So I've got my renal veins contributing, I've got my iliac veins contributing everything from the legs. I have my lumbar veins dumping in from the posterior aspect, my gonadal veins dumping in from the posterior aspect, and then it's kind of like a blank slate until we get way up here just about to the diaphragm. Right at the area just before the IVC goes across the diaphragm into the thoracic canal, we have our three hepatic veins dump into the IVC. So we have our right, our middle, and our left hepatic vein anastomose at the IVC level there. As soon as it crosses the diaphragm, it almost immediately dumps into the right atria. Now, what happened to all those other veins? So we had the superior mesenteric artery come off the aorta, but we didn't have a superior mesenteric vein. Well, we also had a splenic artery come off the aorta, and we didn't have a splenic vein dump into the IVC. So the system that these veins use are called the hepatic and portal system. So we talked about how my hepatic artery provided the liver with all of its oxygenation, despite it only being 30% of the blood supply to the liver. So where does the rest of the blood come from? It comes from our portal system. So our portal vein provides the other 70% of the blood flow to the liver. Now our portal vein comes from the anastomosis of our splenic vein and our superior mesenteric vein. So our spleen is processing blood, utilizing the oxygen, but still cleaning out the blood and putting it into its venous system. The superior mesenteric vein has been out mingling with our small intestines, taking in a lot of nutrients. So while both of these veins are deoxygenated, they have a lot of different components that are going to be very useful, highly nutrient rich, that will be very helpful into our liver. So the remainder 70% of blood flow is coming through this portal system into our liver. Now, that portal system is going to dump blood out into the liver, and then the hepatic veins are going to collect the blood once all of the nutrients and everything are removed, and then it's going to dump it back into the IVC. That brings us to arteries of our lower extremity. So we kind of stopped here just below the inguinal canal. So we know that external iliac artery crossed the inguinal canal and became the common femoral artery. The common femoral artery then divided into the superficial femoral and the deep femoral. So here's my superficial femoral, and here's my deep femoral, which is also known as the profunda. The profunda goes very, very deep and gets hard for us as sonographers to identify. So we really spend most of our time concentrating on the superficial femoral. That superficial femoral winds around the medial part of the thigh, and then it dives posteriorly behind the knee. Once it goes through what we call the adductor canal, then we refer to it as the popliteal. So once it becomes the popliteal, it's just a continuation of that superior femoral artery. Here you see a posterior view of the knee. Here you see an anterior view of the knee, and it runs right down the center of the knee. At the back of the knee, it is going to send off branches for the anterior tibial. So here you see the anterior tibial wrap around. Here is where the anterior tibial is being bifurcated. Once the anterior tibial has been bifurcated, oops, sorry, I think it's here actually on this one. Once the anterior tibia has bifurcated off, then we know this area as the tibio-peroneal trunk. And just as its name suggests, it's going to bifurcate into the posterior tibial veins and the peroneal vein. Oh, artery. I'm so sorry. It's going to bifurcate into the posterior tibial artery and the peroneal artery. And those will go then and provide blood flow to the calf. Now they're going to come together again, and they are going to anastomose here in the anterior aspect of the foot, where we see the dorsal pedis artery and then the digital arteries again. So that posterior tibial artery wraps around, comes medially, travels just superficially to the medial malleolus. The peroneal artery runs a lot deeper and posterior to the fibula. The arteries of the foot are made up of the medial and lateral plantar and the dorsal pedis, and give rise to the plantar arches. Okay, so how we got all of our blood down there, oxygenated blood down there with our arteries. Now how do we get them back? We get them back through the veins. So we're going to start down here. You would have the dorsal pedis vein, and that is going to dump into our posterior tibial veins. Posterior tibial veins will be running up the medial part of the calf, whereas the peroneal veins are going to be running up the posterior part of the calf, and those are going to anastomose to make the tibio-peroneal trunk. Once you see the anterior tibial vein dump into that tibio-peroneal trunk, then it becomes the popliteal vein, and we're going to follow that up the leg. Once it becomes the popliteal vein, it's a larger vein, it's a little easier to follow. It's going to stay the popliteal vein until it goes through the adductor canal again. Then it becomes known as the femoral vein. We can follow it up until it meets and anastomoses with the profunda or deep femoral vein, and then that would become the common femoral vein. And then we do have a superficial vein. That what I just spoke about was all of our deep vein system. We have a superficial femoral vein another superficial vein that's going to come in and anastomose with that deep system, and that vein is called the greater saphenous vein, which we'll look at here in a second. So real quick recap, we have our dorsipedis that is going to dump into our posterior tibials. Our posterior tibials are going to meet up with our perineal. They're going to make the tibio-perineal trunk. When our anterior tibial comes in, that then becomes the popliteal. It stays the popliteal until it reaches the adductor canal. Once through the adductor canal, it becomes the superficial femoral. Once the superficial femoral anastomosis with the profunda, then it becomes the common femoral. And once the common femoral is created, then you can sometimes see the greater saphenous come in and join it. So we really have two superficial veins in the lower extremity. One of them is the greater saphenous. It begins at the dorsal venous arch here in the foot, and it transverses all the way up the medial leg and travels all the way to the common femoral vein. The smaller saphenous vein, similarly, is going to begin as coming off the dorsal venous arch, and it courses posteriorly up the calf, terminates into the popliteal vein, and it's smaller than the greater saphenous. So sometimes you'll hear them called lesser and greater saphenous, sometimes great or small. Now, why does it matter about these superficial versus deep veins? One of the things about superficial veins, they are more superficial to the skin, so they're able to cool more easily, and then they have communications with the deep system to help maintain blood temperature and things like that. The thing about these is they're usually quite small, so when we're looking for any sort of thrombus or something like that, these are usually of much lesser concern because their thrombus would be so much smaller than it would be in the deep system. And that got us to the end of this very long lecture. So I appreciate you guys hanging in here with me. It's a lot of information to fit in 8 short weeks. So our lectures will probably be about this length every week, but we'll try and keep them as interesting and forward moving as possible. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Please feel free to read through the summary and again, reach out with questions. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for joining me.